What's going on, guys? My name is Richard Moglen, and welcome to a very special video where I'll be going through Mark Minervini's sample trades from his outstanding trading performance in 2021, where he gained over 330% and won the US Investing Championship in the Money Manager division, meaning that he started with a $1 million plus account. And he basically released this document right here, which kind of summarizes his year, talks about the trades he makes, and you can see his performance monthly. Really killed it early on in the year and was more tactical during the rest of the year when kind of the opportunities dwindled and the market wasn't quite as good for his trading style. You can also see his account balances, and if you want access to this PDF, he tweeted it out, and I'll link that below in the description, as well as the PDF itself. And in this video, we are going to be going through the sample trades he included as a part of this document here. And keep in mind, he only provided the buy dates for each of these setups. So we don't know about the specific buy point, the sell date, the position size, all of that. So I'm just kind of guessing and interpreting the chart based on my interviews with him, as well as reading his books and attending his Master Trader program. And if you do enjoy this video, please go ahead and leave a like down below. It really does help me out and my channel. And of course, subscribe if you want to see more videos just like this one every single week. And with that said, let's dive into the charts. So starting things off, we've got ANF, Abercrombie and Fitch, and you can see he bought this January 4th, so very early on in 2021. And going through these charts, we're going to be talking a lot about the commonalities that I see within these setups, and really he's very consistent and trading just that VCP setup over and over again, and a lot of these charts look very, very similar. And looking at this chart here, you can see he bought right after this down day right here, as the stock was just moving off the lows of this base here after bouncing off the 50-day moving average. It had pushed up and then kind of went sideways and tight, forming that VCP characteristic up on the right hand side. And you can see corresponding kind of a volume decline within this space after a strong uptrend on volume. So there's really a textbook VCP setup, and I assume he bought using either this high as the pivot or this high right here. And looking at what happened, you can see we actually had a squat on that day. So if he did buy through that pivot, it didn't obviously stop him out. The next day we had really nice volume and a decent close here, and we started a really nice uptrend. And based off kind of what he's told me in interviews, most likely he's selling into strength in this move here right here, but obviously we don't know the details, and he could have held for the longer term move because this did have a really nice trend above the 50-day moving average. But overall, really textbook VCP. I think it's really important to keep in mind that this was in a prior uptrend, nice volume before, and then we see volume decline as stock goes left to right within the base, forms a nice tight area up on the right hand side with a clearly defined pivot point right here. And I like this one because it's a good example of a squat that ultimately works. So moving on, let's talk about GM. And while I'm going through these, I would highly recommend going through this process yourself. Bring these stocks up in your own charting software, kind of analyze these charts, look for commonalities just like I'm doing. And if you have any suggestions or think of things that I forgot to say while looking at these charts, let me know down below in the comment section. So actually looking at the chart of GM now, you can see a prior uptrend above a rising 50-day moving average. We have a pretty organized decline into that key moving average, overall volume decline within the base. And then we have a push off that moving average, looks like a oops reversal right here off the bottom, and actually a potential pivot right through these highs as well as this close right here. However, it looks like he didn't buy it until after this day right here, where we had a push up and then a pullback into this prior pivot. And I really like this day, even though it was a red day on high volume. You see a really nice push off the lows here. And this to me indicates support and accumulation by institutions. And let's go ahead and see what happens right here. So we get a really nice candle here on nice big volume, breaking through this high, which could be an early pivot, as well as the more standard pivot that he likely used right here. And we immediately get follow through, which I find the best breakouts just go immediately. And most likely he's selling into strength on the way up here because that was his style more in 2021. But this actually does set up another base, which I think ultimately doesn't really go anywhere. I think we meet some market pressure, but this does set up another secondary base, which you could have bought the breakout right here, or even through this kind of pivot right in this area up the right hand side, very similar to this setup down here. But overall, nice prior uptrend above the 50-day moving average, nice organized base, really tight here, and then a really clear pivot buy point, which ultimately worked right away. And whether you're a position trader, swing trader, you could have gotten a really nice move out of this stock. Moving on, we've got STAA, which formed a really tight base after a nice uptrend above a rising 50-day moving average. That's a common similarity between a lot of these setups. And you can see it's really tight, only between about 86 and looks like the high 60s. We bounce off the 50-day and just kind of tighten from left to right. And you don't see significant dry up in volume, but most of these volume bars, these high volume bars, are up days, which is constructive. Overall, you've got kind of a clear pivot right at this high near 86. And looking at what happened, we get a nice breakout through these highs. So this could have been the pivot as well as this level right here. And it ultimately just kind of goes sideways here, but is really tight. And even this day, where I'm sure it was pretty negative during the day, finishes really strongly. And then we have a nice move here. I don't know if this was earnings or news, but really nice volume and a breakout here and a nice trend, which most likely he was selling into strength on the way up. So a really nice trade from a very tight base. And once again, we had that prior uptrend where it held the 50-day moving average. And even if you're a position trader and we're holding until it broke the 50-day moving average, you probably got a really nice trade from about 86 to looks like around basically 100, which is a really nice gain in a very short amount of time. So that is STAA. Moving on, we've got Nnox, and I believe I actually trade this one as well. Really classic VCP, prior uptrend, and then you have basically two main contractions within this VCP base. You've got that volume decline as well from left to right. Very classic once again. And on the right hand side, you've got a clear pivot right through these highs, as well as secondary buy points right here and right here. Looking at what happened, you can see a beautiful breakout on volume, very textbook. This, if you want to print it out, is a perfect VCP right here, and it immediately works, and you get a gain from about 55 to almost 92, so almost a double in just 5 trading days. That's explosive, and that's really what the VCP is all about. So this is awesome, and most likely he was selling into strength into this move, and likely wasn't holding it even as it broke the 50-day moving average. So this is really good. You can see the contractions kind of basically getting rid of all that supply that's come to market, and then the stock is really ready to move. And also, this is a pretty low float stock, only about 47 million, so that contributes to that. And of course, you've also got pretty low dollar volume as well, which those two combined factors can really lead to some explosive moves in a short amount of time. So that is NNOX. And moving on to the next stock, we've got UAVS, another really fast mover here. And looking at the setup, you see a beautiful strong uptrend. And even though it went from 299 to about 1314, it set up pretty tightly here. And this was a pretty volatile name, so likely he sized this a little bit less than a usual, more liquid leader. But that's just kind of my interpretation of things. Keep that in mind. But overall, you've got a potential buy point through these highs as well as this high as well. And once again, we're in an uptrend above a rising 50-day moving average. And look at the accumulation right here. Huge blue skyscrapers within this prior uptrend. And then even within the base, no huge volume signatures. And most of the large volume is very constructive on up days. So looking at the resulting factor, you can see a quick move here. Most likely he's selling into strength either on this day or this day as well. And this day, I believe it dropped 70%. So this is a pretty volatile name, so keep that in mind. And most likely he wasn't even involved on this day before it really fell apart and was selling into strength right here. So that is UAVS, definitely a very quick mover, but also a pretty powerful setup. Moving on, we've got MP. This is a familiar name to many of you. And looking at the buy point, you can see you had a clear buy point pivot right here, just below 34.92. Once again, a prior uptrend above a rising 50-day moving average, pretty tight base as well, and looks very constructive. You got that volume decline from left to right, and once again, the clear pivot right here, which most likely he was using, and you've also got a potential buy point through the prior day's high as well, and you can manage risk pretty tightly at this higher low of this low right here, or even the low of the breakout day. And looking at what happened, you can see a really nice trend, most likely once again selling into strength, and maybe even stopped out of the remainder of his position on this day or this day right here. And once again, really nice volume coming in on the breakout. That's exactly what you want to see. And even as it pushed up, it kind of stalled and then reconfirmed. Most likely you want to raise your stops at this low on that day. That's something I learned from Oliver Kell, who of course won the USIC back in 2020 with another outstanding performance. So that is MP. Once again, we've got that similarity of a strong uptrend above a rising 50-day moving average, a base forming above that moving average, and then a nice VCP forming, drawing out that supply, and a clear pivot forming up the right hand side. Moving on, we've got Greenbox Gbox, prior uptrend above the 50-day moving average, very tight base here. Once again, a very low dollar volume name, so most likely not a huge position that he's taking here. And you've got that volume decline from left to right and a clear pivot forming right here above 14.21, as well as potentially this high. And of course, you've got the standard base pivot, but most likely he's using this pivot through these highs. Looking at the breakout, you had a clear pivot breakout through this level right here. Really nice volume, the highest volume looks like in quite a while, and you've got a clear breakout both in volume and price. That's the key thing you want to see. Great fall through the next day as well, and most likely he's selling into this strength, into that liquidity as well, and not hanging around for this type of move back downward. So that is GBOX, very similar prior uptrend above a rising 50-day moving average, setting up that VCP. Moving on, we've got Yeti, and this is the setup within the base, a little bit choppy in here, and he bought it on this day and looks like it squatted on him, but you've got that clear pivot right here. But once again, you've got a gradual decline from left to right within this base, setting up a pretty powerful mover. And moving forward, let's take a look at what happened. You had a nice move after the squat, inside day again, and then you have a breakout from those inside days, and most likely he was selling into strength up in this area as it kind of stalled out, although it did hold the 50-day moving average and go on a nice run after this. So that is Yeti, YETI, and once again, you've got that prior uptrend and then that base forming, holding near that support level. So that is Yeti. And moving on, we've got our next stock, Zim. Obviously, many of you have traded this, a really nice move, and bases forming within its IPO run. And this is really textbook, although it was a very short base. You've got a clear pivot right here with an inside day. And looking at what happened, you can see an explosive move, really high volume as well. Then it just kind of goes sideways, but then reconfirms and continues higher. So I don't know if he was selling into strength in this area or holding for more of this move, but this was a really strong stock during this time and just riding that 10-day moving average, 21 EMA and 50 SMA to higher prices during this IPO run. Moving on, we've got Bntx, another high flyer from this year, a prior uptrend above a rising 50-day moving average. We do have some distribution at the left side of this base, but you can see how kind of supply is wrung out during these contractions and volume really declines until that breakout point, which had a really strong closing range on high volume. And you had a clear pivot through this high as well as this high as well. And I really love how tight this got on the right-hand side. Looking at what happened, you can see a nice push from this point. Most likely he's selling into strength right here and not holding through this kind of just gradual pullback to the 50-day moving average. Moving on, we've got HSKA, which was one I'm not really familiar with, but looking at this chart, it's a really nice base after a strong uptrend. Once again, a very common trait of all these setups. And the buy point is kind of different than many of these. It looks like maybe a DTL break or fall through from this day right here off the 50-day moving average. So potentially a pullback buy, a little bit different than the classic VZP buys. But nevertheless, you've got a constructive base, nice rounded look to it, and basically really constructive volume and price action, respecting that KMA up the right-hand side of this base. Looking at what happened, you can see that it looks like maybe he bought through the breakout with this high. It stalled out a little bit. Maybe he used this prior higher low as his stop, but never really broke that or challenged that, and then went on to have a really nice breakout. And this to me would be the more classic VCP buy point up the right-hand side of this base. You've got this pivot lining up as well, and you can see the explosive move from that setup as well. And as previously mentioned, he's selling into strength, usually into this move. I would basically hypothesize. So another really nice mover. This was a name I'm not really familiar with. Once again, a pretty low dollar volume stock and really low float. I think that's key. And when you have that combination, basically really low float and low dollar volume, these things can really move. So size accordingly, but these can be explosive gainers in a very short amount of time. Moving on, we've got TSP, a recent IPO, which formed basically a VCP right off the gate. Once again, you've got a contraction in price and volume from left and right within this space, and a really clearly defined pivot right here as well as right here, which is most likely the classic VCP pivot that he was using, and a super explosive move from this point. And you can see a breakout both in price and volume. That's kind of clear within the best setups here. And it looks like it was up all the way from below 40 to 45 in one day. And he might even be selling into that strength, or going forward, selling into strength further on within the move, maybe holding basically half from this point, selling half as it continues to make profit for him. And potentially he could have even held it all the way until it reached near 80 right here, selling into that strength the last half. So that is TSP, a really explosive move from the IPO base, very similar to kind of PLTR. If you go back in 2020 and take a look at that chart as it formed that base right off the gate, right after its IPO. Moving on, we've got a little known company called Apple, and you can see a really big base after an uptrend, and it does kind of form a base within a base, and you've got a pivot clearly defined up the right hand side of that smaller base, and you've got a kind of big VCP and then even a smaller VCP right here, and you do see volume contract a little bit in this later base. So from this point, we have a nice breakout, decent trend above the 10-day moving average, even though you don't see it here, and most likely he's selling into strength right in this area, and not holding for the longer move and waiting for another base to form. So that is Apple. Definitely a good example of trading kind of a blue chip name, higher dollar volume name with the same strategy. Moving on, we've got Moderna. Taking a look at this chart, you have some contractions here, although the overall base is kind of rising, and you've got a clear pivot right here as well as this high as well. Not really a volume dry up on this one, but this is showing a lot of strength, a lot of power. And taking a look at what happens, you can see it basically stalled out for 1 or 2 days, but then continued on. You had maybe an oops reversal here, and most likely he's either selling into strength in this area, or if he is holding it, selling into strength on these days right here. Although this did have a really powerful run from 230 all the way up to near 500. Moving on, we've got our next stock, SKY. Once again, you've got a prior uptrend, then the base forming, and this looks like a lower dollar volume and float name. And you can see you bought it after the breakout through the pivot, which is right here or right here. And take a look at what happened. You can see basically an inside day. So he bought maybe a pullback to this prior pivot, and then it stalls out for a few days and then kind of reconfirms. And most likely he's selling into strength in this area or maybe up in here. So that is SKY, another good example of a really strong prior uptrend and then a base forming with a clear pivot. Moving on, we've got our next stock, NUE. There's a name I traded as well. And overall, you've got that prior uptrend above a rising 50-day moving average, then the overall base forming, and you've got a little bit of a double bottom here, undercut of these lows, and then a strong rally, and then a clear pivot forming right here up the right-hand side. And looking at what happened, you can see a nice breakout through that DTL and nice fall through as well the next day on large volume. So you've got that clear DTL and volume and then explosion on that breakout, which is ideal. And ideally, he's selling into strength up in this area. Moving on, we've got PAG, which had a textbook VCP, one contraction, and another one here, a clear pivot through these highs. And this might have even been an early buy point as well. And you've got nice volume coming in here, kind of preempting the breakout. And looking at what happened, you can see that it didn't quite fall through, actually pull back to the 50-day moving average once again. So maybe you were stopped out here, but it looks like he wasn't stopped out, and maybe his stop was all the way down here. But nevertheless, it does set up another pivot right here, which could have been rebought even if you were stopped out. And we go on a really nice run from about 89, 90 all the way up to 108, 110 in just a few trading days. And you can see the volume coming in on this breakout. And once again, you've got a lot of pivots lining up at very similar levels, which often leads to that very explosive move. Moving on, we've got our next stock, which is Tesla. This was forming that giant base, very giant VCP, forming a pivot right at these levels. And take a look at his buy point. You've got a clear breakout through that point. Not huge volume, but you've got a gradual climb up here. And a lot of people are watching this pivot, so there's a little bit lower within that base, which gives you kind of that added cushion when we do see potentially some volatility, some sideways action right at those kind of more obvious pivots to the market, when there's kind of a lot of eyes on this, and there's basically an exchange in shares from the people who bought this breakout and are very short term with the people who are trying to buy this overall breakout. So from this point, it goes sideways and then just kind of gradually increases here, and most likely he's selling into strength into this breakout and up in here potentially with his last shares. Moving on, we've got OLN, and once again we have that prior uptrend above the 50-day moving average, base forming. It doesn't get too tight, but in these last few days it does get pretty tight, forming a breakout pivot right at 50 pretty much. And looking at his buy point, you see it actually stalls out, squats, pulls back, doesn't break the 50-day moving average or this prior low, and reconfirms, and then has a really nice breakout through another pivot right through these levels on volume, and goes on a really nice run for a few days Once again, he's most likely selling into the strength because he is a swing trader and was really doing that a lot in 2021 when we weren't really getting fall through for weeks and months, and you just kind of have to take the profits when you have them. Next up, we've got Asus, and we've got a prior uptrend with nice volume in here, then a nice rounded long base, and then almost a base within a base with a nice pivot forming right near 1217. This is a really low dollar volume stock, only 430.9K, and very low float as well. So this could be a potential power mover, and you have good upside reversals, good price action within this handle, and a clear pivot right near that 1217 mark. And taking a look at the breakout, we see a really nice breakout on volume. Then it squats for one day, has basically an inside day, and really falls through on volume through this pivot. So really fast mover, going from 12.17 all the way up to 15 in just a matter of a few days. Most likely he's selling into strength because you do basically need to get that liquidity with such a low dollar volume name. So that is Asus. And moving on, we've got a name that he's probably well known for, UPST. And you've got a clear pivot buy point. I made this pretty much this exact same trade. Nice breakout here on volume from this very short handle within this very stubby base in a nice prior uptrend. And taking a look at what happened, we have some distribution here. I sold in these areas. I think I sold most of my position on this day. And then as it fell through the downside after this day, I sold the rest of it right here for a nice quick swing trade. And likely he did a similar thing, kind of selling it as it kind of broke that trend and ended this short-term momentum burst. So that is UPST. And lastly, we've got Nvidia, which is the lone short that he includes here. We've got a prior uptrend above 50-day moving average, but the market was a little bit weak. We've got a lot of churning in here within the space. This is something that I've noticed in hindsight. And we have a breakthrough the bottom of this range. This kind of a wedge drop if you use the Oliver Cal terminology, and this kind of starts a leak downwards. And most likely he's selling into this move downward and maybe the last bit on this gap up and strong close near his cost. So overall, that's a run through of basically the sample trades that he provided. Definitely a lot of similarities. All of them are pretty much in uptrends above a rising 50-day. You've got that classic VCP tightening left to right, both in price and volume, and a clearly defined pivot point. And then from that point, we don't know his sells because he didn't provide them. But as he said in multiple interviews, he was selling a lot in strength, even as the stock was working, because he was taking very levered positions. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please go ahead and leave a like down below and subscribe if you're new to the channel. And I'll see you guys in future videos. Thanks.